welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in June. So I have 7 books that I completed in the month of June, and then also in addition to that, 1 that I DNF'd and 2 or 3 actually. No, 4. I'm not organized today. 4 books that I am still in the progress of. Pretty much all of those were mentioned in my July TBR video, so I'll link that and you can check that out. But I figured I would also update you on how my summer book bingo is going. As you can see, I do not have any bingos yet, but I am close to several. Like I only need 2 here, 2 here, 2 here, and a lot of these I am planning to read in the month of July, so you can check out that video and see which books I kind of have slated for some of these spots. So the first book that I want to talk about is actually, I think, the very first book that I finished in the month, but I also want to talk about it first because I'm afraid I'll forget to mention it because it's already been returned to the library, and that is volume 1 of Fruits Basket. This is my very first manga that I ever read, and it's one that Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space has mentioned absolutely loving, so I picked it up and I struggled with it at first. I actually did have a vlog where I read this one and then the next book that I'm going to talk about, so I'll link that vlog so you can check that out if you want to hear more detailed thoughts. But the Cliff's Notes version is that initially I did have trouble reading it, and I thought it was me because I was reading my very first manga, and so I was trying to adjust from reading from right to left, both on the page and then reading the right page and then the left page. It was odd for me, to say the least. But I have since talked to several people who said that they had a hard time reading Fruits Basket, and it made me feel better. It makes me think that if I hadn't read Fruits Basket first, I actually would have had a harder time because I would have been comparing it. I thought it was just me adjusting, but when I hear other people talk about how the art style, particularly in volume 1, and I think maybe volume 2, is kind of chaotic, like some of the panels, and they're kind of difficult to read and follow. I did read another manga this month and did not feel that way about that one. So I do think that it was Fruits Basket and not me. But because I didn't know that, I stuck with it, and I'm really glad that I did because I really liked the storyline. It's about this girl, Toru Honda, and she basically gets thrown out of her house for reasons, and she ends up staying with these guys who are all part of this family, and in their family, each family member represents an animal of the Chinese zodiac. And when a member of the opposite gender hugs them, they turn into that animal. So it's a very interesting premise, but I love Toru Honda, the main character. She is just the best. She's so positive and so optimistic, and she believes the best in people and sees good things even in not so good people, and that brings out the best in them, and I absolutely love that. And I felt like Fruits Basket was worth reading for her character alone, but there are other things in it that I enjoyed as well. So that was actually this little butterfly here, which was for a graphic novel or a manga. The next book that I want to talk about was also in that same vlog video where I talked about Fruits Basket. There are loud trucks outside. I think it's a trash truck, so I'm sorry there's a lot of background noise. Anyways, it was in that vlog video, and I also talked about it in my mid-year freakout video, and that is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. So this is a fantasy book. It has a very interesting and detailed fantasy world, which I really love. There's also a lot of religious systems in this book. It seems like there's like a god or a goddess for many things, and I just was enthralled by this book. And it was kind of a slow start for me because we start out with the main character, Locke Lamora, who is a child who has essentially been kidnapped. Well, he was an orphan, but he was kidnapped and then sold into slavery, and the man who bought him is training him to be like an expert thief. So it's very heist based, kind of reminds me of Oliver Twist in that way. But we switch back and forth between scenes of Locke's childhood, and now he's an adult, and him with his friends who are also raised and trained by this man, and their exploits and them trying to pull off like the biggest heist of all time. And I don't know, there's something about it that just drew me in. And this is not my normal kind of book. So that's why it was kind of surprising to me that I loved it so much. I just really got invested in the characters, really loved this like band of thieves, but I mean they're more like a band of brothers even though they're not biologically related. And I just loved the found family, and the friendships in this book were very heartwarming even though a lot of this book was not. So be forewarned that a lot of this book is quite dark. There are some kind of like intense torture scenes that probably border on grimdark, but I haven't read any grimdark things, so I can't really compare that. And there's a lot of language in this book as well. So if those are all things that really bother you, I would not recommend for you to pick up this book. Normally that's something that I don't typically pick up books that are like that, but for some reason this book just really drew me in. It was a surprise to me. So The Lies of Lamora filled this space right here for a fantasy. I also have this space right here that is a novella or a short story. So I'm just gonna briefly say that I'm counting this book for it. I'm not completed this book yet. This is A Bad Business and their Dostoevsky short stories. This edition is a new translation that was recently published by Pushkin Press. So far, I'm finding it to be an excellent and very readable and enjoyable translation. But I have read 3 of the 6 short stories in here. So the title story, A Bad Business, is the one that I counted for that space. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it because I would love to do a video when I'm done reading this, ranking the short stories in this collection and talking about them a bit more. So I'm just kind of leaving it open-ended, but just saying that because it did fill a spot on my summer book bingo. I think maybe that this is the next book that I read, but I'm not totally sure. I'm a little, like I said, disorganized today, so sorry about that. But this book I'm using for this space right here, I think it's this space, which is a book that was recommended by a friend. And for that book, I have A Shadow in Summer by Daniel Abraham. I have had a lot of people recommend this book to me. I have just seen it making the rounds. I know that this is Alan from the Library of Alexandria's one of his favorite series. This is the first book in that series. And I actually watched a excellent video that was an introduction to the series, and I'll link that so you can watch it because I think that he talks in detail about this book better than I ever could, and I think that it's a really good introduction. But this is book 1 of a quartet, and I had a lot of people recommend it to me for several reasons. First of all, I have said many times that something that I love in fantasy books is politics. I hate real world politics, but politics in fantasy worlds are just fascinating to me. So this book is very political. It has a lot of Asian elements to it, and it's very slow. So it's very character based. And I feel like we go really, really deep into characters, and the magic in this world is fascinating. Basically, there are these kind of spirit type things called ondats. And essentially they are ideas that have taken physical form through these people called poets. And the poets basically have some sort of idea, and they use words and poetry and different things to bind the ondat into a physical form. So it was formless and now it has a physical form, and the poet keeps control of the ondat, and different ondats have different abilities based on kind of the words that they use, and all their skills that the ondats have are based basically on how the poet has bound them, which sounds really complicated, and it is, but the way that it's introduced gradually in a way that makes sense and is explained a lot better than how I am doing it right now. So this story basically follows one poet and then someone who was supposed to become a poet but walked away, and they live in the city, Sarah Kate, and they are dealing with a lot of political unrest because there are houses from other countries that have like trading houses in this city because it's like a port city. And so there's a lot of undermining and, places trying to take over the city. But this city has a lot of power thanks to the poet and the ondat. This ondat's name, I think, is Seedless, and his ability is to take out like the thing that continues life, and the cotton trade is huge in the city. So he's able to like basically at a snap of a finger just cause all the seeds to fall out of the cotton that they pick, and then they're able to process it much more quickly, which gives them kind of an edge on cotton and trading and all of that kind of stuff. I do think that this book is just, it was excellent. I loved the character development. I felt like I was really in the characters' heads and really understood them, even if I didn't agree with the decisions that they were making. I understood why they were making them, and I thought that everything about this book was really wonderful. I will say that there are elements in this book that could be not so great for certain people. So I would recommend you to check trigger warnings for this book. It's not super detailed, but there is a huge part of the plot that revolves around a certain incident, and you may or may not want to read about that, but could be considered a little spoilery, so I'm not going to mention it here. But I will say that Storygraph has like content warnings on it, and where it has what the moderate content warning is on this book would be what I'm talking about. So if you want to check trigger warnings, I would recommend that you do so. All right, so the next space on my summer book bingo board is right here, which was a buddy read. And for that one, I did The Once and Future King by T.H. White. This is an Arthurian retelling, and I buddy read this with Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot. And I think we had pretty similar feelings on this book, and that our feelings were quite mixed, to be honest. I had a hard time rating this book because there are 4 books within this volume that are all about King Arthur. So book 1 is The Sword and the Stone, and that is basically, you know, the story of Arthur growing up. And if you've seen the Disney movie The Sword and the Stone, this was the source material for it. So there's a lot of familiarity there, but a lot of scenes that were different and added that the movie didn't have. In terms of, one of my favorite things about the Sword and the Stone movie is how often Wart turns into animals, and there's so many more animals that he turns into in this book. So I gave Sword and the Stone 5 stars. I thought it had a lot of humor, a lot of funny side characters, loved the interactions between Merlin and Wart, loved Archimedes the owl, you know, it was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. Book 2 is The Queen of Air and Darkness, and this I think was probably my least favorite of the 4, and it's definitely very, for the most part, tonally different than book 1. Arthur is now king, and he is an adult, and it's kind of dealing with the war between him and other places, and he's trying to kind of discern the whole thing of like, do we have wars just to prove that we're the greatest, or because we're actually trying to do the right thing? So he's exploring that whole might versus right kind of mentality, and that's where he comes up with the Knights of the Round Table. So we get insight into that, but most of the story I felt like was completely unnecessary and didn't need to be its own book. It could have been a couple of scenes. It also introduces us to one of the knights, Gawain, and then his brothers, and also the introduction of like who Mordred is, who I hadn't heard of because I'm not super familiar with Arthurian lore. So there's all that kind of stuff, but it just like, it was a lot. It was more than it needed to be, and there were still elements of humor that felt reminiscent of the first book, because Merlin was still in here, and there was a character, King Pellinor, who was hilarious in The Sword and the Stone. He was in here, and he was really funny, and so I liked all the scenes that he was in, but most of this I just felt wasn't necessary. And the queen, that is like the title queen, I know we're trying to establish that she's evil, but there's some pretty not great to read animal torture scenes in here that I think is just supposed to illustrate how icky she is, but that doesn't mean I liked reading them. And then the third book is, I think it's The Ill-Made Knight. Yes, The Ill-Made Knight. And this is basically Lancelot's story. So we actually follow Lancelot a lot more closely than we follow Arthur. And this, I think, was the second longest story in this book. And it felt way longer than The Sword and the Stone to me. It was just very dramatic. All the Lancelot and Guinevere drama. And it just felt like it was too much, honestly, and I just got really, really tired of it. Sandy described it as a soap opera, and I think that that is accurate. There were moments where knights would come back to the castle and talk about their quests, especially when they were going on like the quest for the Holy Grail. They would come back and they would talk about what they did, and they'd have multiple knights come back and tell Arthur and Guinevere about their quests. And that was probably my favorite part of this whole book. And I wish there had been more of that and less pining. I don't know. I didn't love it. The last book was The Candle in the Wind, and this was my second favorite of the 4 books. This follows Arthur kind of towards the end of his life. It follows him and still Lancelot and Guinevere and Mordred, and just kind of like the animosity that's brewing there and just different things. If you're not familiar with Arthurian lore, I won't spoil it because I had no idea how this story was going to end. And I think that that's why I liked book 4 so much, is because there was enough action and plotting and different things that were happening that I didn't know how it was going to end. And so I found it very interesting and really enjoyed it. I loved the end because then Arthur is reflecting on why he created the Round Table and everything with the knights and all those things that happened. He's reflecting on all of that, you know, towards the end of his life because he's an old man now. And I loved that. That was probably my favorite part, actually, because it kind of tied in with book 2 and his motivations and why he created the Round Table and how it went wrong and all of those kinds of things. So I think the rating that I ended up giving this book was 4 stars, which feels a little bit generous considering that middle portion was hard for me. Books 2 and 3 were difficult for me to read and I wasn't enjoying it as much. But overall, I really loved book 1 and I really loved book 4. So overall, I would give it 4 stars because I do think I would read it again and I'm really happy that I read it. But there were elements, it was not perfect for me, for sure. All right, the next book that I read was for this space right here, which is the historical space. For that, I have a historical fiction that I read, and that is The Book of Lost Friends by Lisa Wingate. This was also for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge because I think it had to have a book on the cover, and I cheated because it's got the word book. So this book is a historical fiction. It's dual timeline, which is not my favorite, to be honest, because a lot of times I'll like one timeline and not the other and just wish we could stay in one timeline, and I feel kind of jolted. There were some elements of that here. I'll get into that in just a second. But as an introduction, the one storyline begins in Louisiana in the late 1800s in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And then the second timeline takes place in the 1980s in Louisiana with a school teacher coming into the town where the main character in the other plot line is from. She was a slave who has been freed, but right before all the slaves were freed, her family was sold off one by one. They were stolen from their masters and sold off one by one. And so she has no idea where any of her family is. So she kind of ends up on a quest with her master's daughter and then his daughter with a mistress as well. And they kind of end up on this quest. And in the process, she's trying to kind of find where her family is and all of that kind of stuff. I will say positive things about this book that I actually genuinely liked both of the main characters, and that doesn't usually happen in a dual timeline. However, I did feel like both timelines we didn't need both stories. I didn't feel like they actually impacted each other in a super meaningful way. I also I just in general don't love the switching back and forth between storylines, and this book proved kind of why, because we would end a chapter with Hanny, who was the girl who was enslaved and now she's free. We'd end a chapter with her and it would be like almost this cliffhanger type of thing. And then we'd go ahead and switch to the school teacher. And then when we switch back to Hanny, instead of actually picking up where we left off, all of a sudden it'd be 2 days later and it would tell you in a few sentences how that situation played out. And I didn't like that. I was like, this feels really jolting and choppy. So I didn't really like that. I will say I liked the writing style a lot. I thought that a lot of the writing was very beautiful in terms of describing places that they went and just little nuggets of wisdom in there that were beautiful. But ultimately I kind of felt like it was forgettable. I did not cry at this book. I was fully expecting to cry. My older sister bought me this book and she said it made her cry, and I didn't even get choked up. I was surprised. I was expecting it, but it didn't happen. I rated this book 3 stars because it was a decent book and it was fine, but I don't think it's one that's really gonna stick with me. Next up, I'm gonna talk about the other manga that I read, which I used on my bingo board for a book in a series, which was this space right here. And this is book 1 of a manga series, and I'm already in love with this series, only having read the first book, and that's Spy Family. And I was really worried I wasn't gonna love it because a whole bunch of people talked about how much they loved it. It's really popular right now. I'm seeing it make the rounds on BookTube, and I think part of the reason for that is because there's an anime series that just came out about it. Anyways, this is, if you haven't heard of it already, which you probably have, this is about this man right here, and he is a spy, and he is given a mission where he needs to kind of take down this political figure, and the way that they want to get to this person is that his child attends this really prestigious private school, and so they tell him, in order to get to this person, you need to adopt a child that you can enroll in the school, and then the school has a requirement that both parents need to attend the interview or whatever. So he finds out he needs to get married also, and it's so funny. So he ends up adopting this little girl and doesn't know that she's a telepath. So she knows exactly what he's thinking. She knows he's a spy and all these things. And then the woman that he ends up marrying is actually an assassin. He doesn't know she's an assassin, but the child does because she's a telepath, and neither of them know that she's a telepath. So it's just really funny. I loved the situations that they got into in this book. I loved their interactions. The little girl is so cute. I'm gonna see if I can find a picture of her. Here she is. Anya. She's adorable. And I really liked the art style of this as well. So I just loved this. I have the next couple of volumes out from the library, so I will hopefully be reading those soon. The last book that I finished this month is Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. I loved this book so much. I read this along with Krista from Books and Jams because she was doing a nonfiction read along for the month of June, and this was the book that she chose, and I'm so glad that she did. I'm kind of hesitant going into a lot of like modern Christian nonfiction because I don't feel like there's necessarily been time for certain things to be vetted. It hasn't stood the test of time like a lot of classic Christian nonfictions have. So I tend to be just a little bit more hesitant and wary going into it. I tend to pick it apart a little bit more than I would than a book that is much older. And this book is only a couple of years old. I think it was published in 2020. I needn't have worried. This book is wonderful. So this book is basically about Christ's heart for us. And so it goes into his heart when we are struggling with sin or when we're suffering or different things like that. And it was just very encouraging to me and very wonderful. But then I also love the author kind of goes into, you know, we talk about, oh, how God acted in the Old Testament with wrath and how is that possibly compatible with Christ in the New Testament? And he talks about all that in this book in a way that is very meaningful, a way that's very good, a way that's very scriptural. And he also quotes a lot of Puritans in this, which is very interesting. And I really liked that as well. So overall, I just really enjoyed this book. It was an easy 5 stars for me because it was just very meaningful. My experience reading this was so good. I think it's good for anyone who is struggling with legalism or struggling with sin in their lives or is a new believer and just kind of wants to be a little bit more rooted. I felt like this was good for all of those things. But I will mention, in case this is something that bothers you doctrinally, if you are not a Calvinistic / Reformed theology person, this book very heavily is. And it's not like it's every single chapter, but when it's in there, it's like really in there and it is like very heavy-handedly Calvinistic. And so if you come from more of an Arminian Wesleyan faith background and you're not into that kind of stuff, you don't agree with that kind of stuff, that might really bother you. I do come from an Arminian Wesleyan background in Christian doctrine, and it didn't bother me. I still found enough that I could agree with and love and call this a 5-star book. But I know some people can get more hung up on that kind of stuff than I do, and that is totally fine. But I just wanted to put that out there in case that is something that would bother you enough that you might not want to read it. I do have one more book that I'm going to mention here, and this is a DNF, and it's kind of a soft DNF because I only just decided that I'm going to DNF it for now because I'm having a really hard time reading it. And that's Isaac Storm by Eric Larson. This is a nonfiction book that is about the flood that hit Galveston as a result of a hurricane in the year 1900. And I believe it is still to date the most deadly storm in American history. But I'm really struggling reading it. And I don't think that it's the writing style. I think that it's me. I think I'm just not all that interested in what he's saying because we are talking about the actual man who is the meteorologist and his history. And I was enjoying those parts, but they're going back into the history of meteorology and where some of these findings came from. And if I'm just being totally honest, earth science is by far my least favorite type of science, and I don't find it interesting at all. And so I'm struggling with those sections, and I'm sure that it gets better because there are times where I read it and I was in the mood for it and it was fine. But I'm 80 pages in, so I didn't even get that far. And I just every time I picked it up, for the most part, I was really struggling with it. And I just think that this is not what my brain wants to read right now. And I was trying really hard to read it because I had some people tell me that they loved it. And anytime someone tells me that, I always feel bad when I don't finish it. But I just decided, you know what? I have so many other books that I really want to be reading. So I decided to put this one down. I did not use any space on my bingo board for it because I don't think I was far enough along to really count it. If I was halfway, 3/4 of the way, maybe that would have been different. But I've been working on this book for months. Seriously, 2 or 3 months I've been reading this book, and I'm still only 80 pages into it. And I finally decided, you know what? I can try this again another time. I don't have to read it right now. It's fine. So I'm not planning on getting rid of it or anything. I'm planning on trying it again. And I have a couple other Eric Larson books that I think the plot line would be a little bit more interesting to me. Plotline's not the right word for a nonfiction, is it? I think the events that he's writing about would be more interesting to me than this one because I just don't care about all the meteorology. I don't think that it's poorly written. I think it's me. All right, so those are the books that I completed this month. I am still in the middle of A Bad Business and The Count of Monte Cristo and The Lord God Made Them All by James Herriot, and also the second book of the Long Price Quartet. I believe it's called A Betrayal in Winter. So I am still in the middle of 4 books, most of which I didn't mention here except for A Bad Business. But those are the books that I read in June. So I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. What did you read in June? Did you have any books that you absolutely loved? I always love chatting with you guys in the comments. It's just the best. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. Now I will see you again next time.